So with Pico Neo, and hypothetically, ByteDance does obtain them, and hypothetically they become consumer in the West. Although I think they're majorly B2B right now.
Yeah.
And more asterisks, putting aside the privacy conversation because that's just gonna kill any discussion. What pain point could that potentially solve that would maybe help your thoughts on Facebook? Because I'm sure they'd have to adapt to that. But what's the pain point that solves for you?
Well, actually, I'll give you an exact story. So the third VR startup I was working on, which I'm actually taking a break from being a founder. You know, that's probably news I haven't told everybody yet.
You're better off mentally forward for a while.
Yeah, so I need to take a little bit of a break from being a founder. Although it's a larger conversation I'll touch on later. But the third startup I was working on, the pitch was connecting millions of headsets to billions of phones. So the whole idea is that while people are in VR, they can't easily communicate outwardly, you know, and people who are on their phones, you know, there's billions of people with phones, so they could create, you know, asynchronous communication between headsets and phones. That was the third VR startup I was working on, which I recently left. There's still some work on that, but you know, it's not going to be like one of my big, you know, announcements of my prior two startups because I'm just fucking tired. I'm tired of the shit, and I'll tell you why. Because, okay, let's just say I were to release this. First of all, Facebook is 80% of the marketplace, and what constitutes a monopoly by the United States government is over 60%. So we're way beyond what constitutes a monopoly. And the problem I had with that startup is I go, okay, if I release this, it's cross-platform, but who fucking cares? Because there's no other significant headset adoption. And so if Pico came in here and say that Pico had a significant percent of the standalone market, the value of a cross-platform communication application is significantly more. So, you know, like for example, let's use prior examples. WhatsApp. Would WhatsApp ever have been valuable if it only exists on iOS? The answer is no, because they just come out with iMessage and just be like, buy WhatsApp, don't care about you. So as a startup, you generally have to think, you know, I've talked about this before, you generally have to think horizontally or vertically. So for example, Peloton is completely vertical, right? You get the Peloton, you have the shows, they're not dependent on really any third party. Even the coaches that they have are hired internally. Right, so they're a vertically integrated company. So, and the value of a vertically integrated company is the fact that you don't create dependencies. You know, Oculus is a vertically integrated company. But if you're trying to build something cross-platform, and generally this is one of the biggest goals of like Slack and Twitter and, you know, all these social communication applications. Even what I was building at YUR was only valuable because it was on Google Fit, Apple Health, and Quest, and Steam. Right? Yep. Like, what the fuck is the value of a fitness tracker if it only works in one game on one headset? Zero value, right?
Yes.
So the problem is when we have market consolidation like this, horizontal companies can't exist. And so when Pico comes into the market, if they get any significant amount of them, all of a sudden it opens up these startups that otherwise couldn't exist. Like, for example, even Guy Godin, right? If he has virtual desktop on both the Pico and the Quest, now when someone goes and they check, okay, am I going to do AirLink or am I going to do virtual desktop? They think, well, if I get virtual desktop, I can use it on my Pico too. And you know what? I might switch to Pico. So this monopolization of the market kills the ability to build so many different startups in the space. And then it's what's happening right now. You know, the only thing that they're acquiring is game studios because they know they can co-op everybody else, right? That's why all the features, VR for work, fitness. Fuck, I never thought Facebook would get into fitness. Man, I remember when I was pitching this. Like,
let's break it down. I got. Remind me to get back to monopolies if I forget. But I think the most pressing question that I have for you, in my mind, like, what do you consider virtual desktop? Is that a game or is that a utility?
I'd say utility. I mean, it's definitely more on the utility side. Yeah.
Granted, that's a utility I think they can't control as much as they want to, but I see Facebook mostly buying utilities at the moment. Make it so, like, they could make a Quest 3 or Quest 2 Pro, and all these things they've basically bought, they claim those as utility and claim it as a feature that no one else can do, right?
Right.
We haven't seen anything from Pico and ByteDance, so it's completely speculative. What gives you faith that a Pico run system by ByteDance would be open enough to even be different than Facebook and allow cross-platform? Would they just want to buy the utilities as well and be the exact same thing, just the Eastern version of it?
So generally, the way that I view technology cycles is looking into the past to see the future. And if you remember, this dynamic when the original smartphones came out, right? There was, the approach that Apple took, which is everything's closed down. They didn't even have an app store in the very beginning. And everything's first party and we're super closed down. They didn't start opening up until Android came in there and they go, you know what? Put fucking everything on there. We don't care. Don't put spyware on there. Don't put viruses on there. But otherwise, do whatever the hell you want. If you want a flashlight app that, flashes and strobes and gives everybody, like any of these issues, right? Like they were much more hands off.
Yes.
And that tug and pull between these huge corporations is what drives innovation. And if Facebook is incredibly closed down to the point that they can't allow anything, and a counter comes into the market, the counter is going to have to represent something fundamentally different. Otherwise, they're just going to flash pan and disappear. So if Pico comes in and they say, we're going to be as closed as Facebook, no one's going to give a shit. No one's going to buy a Pico, right? But if they come in here and say, yeah, all the stuff that Facebook is screwing, we're now going to have an open market. All these developers are now going to be like, wow, this is a better platform for me. And then what's going to happen is Facebook's going to be like, oh, we're nicer to developers now, and then it's going to create that balance. But we don't have that right now because HTC, like the entire value of the company is a few years of losses of what they're spending on Oculus. Like Oculus is burning like $6 billion a year, right? Yes. That's like a whole Valve a year.
Yeah, but at the same time,
put it in perspective.
The monopoly conversation, I was thinking about it last night when you brought it up, and I was gonna speak, but I figured I'm not gonna waste the time since I got you today. Yes, I get the mathematical from 80% by definition they're monopoly, although, there's always going to be gray areas in there. But aren't they in that position because everyone else just shit the bed? They're 80% because everyone else gave up. I mean,
it's not that simple. Okay,
it's not that simple.
Let's take HTC for example, right? Mm-hmm. You could subjectively say their new Focus, what is it, Focus 3? Yep. New Focus 3 is an objectively better piece of hardware. A lot of people have said that. It's faster, it has higher build quality, etc. Oftentimes, a company like that, when they go up against, something like Facebook, they go, well, we're not going to win consumers, so we can't even try, right? Because the only avenue that they have for profitability now is to approach businesses and go, hey, are you going to buy a $1,300 headset? Because for them, on gross margins of hardware, generally speaking, if you're not doing something like a console approach, or you're not doing something like what Google does, where they subsidize all their hardware and make it back in advertising and stuff like that, you have to sell generally a hardware product of twice of your bill of materials, at least twice, because that covers returns and manufacturing and all that other thing. So generally, that's probably what the Focus 3 is. It's probably 2x what their build of materials is. So that would assume the build of materials is what, like $600, $700 or something like that. So that's realistically how much these headsets cost.
Yeah, no, speaking with Yukai Chow of HTC, he didn't say it verbatim, but pretty much alluded to that. I think he alluded that he knows what Facebook's paying for that. And I think he thinks it costs around $650 to $700 for each Oculus Quest.
That's exactly what I'm thinking. Yeah, a lot of people think, oh, these sensors, whatever, that's the real build of materials of a hardware product. But they don't realize Qualcomm charges licensing fees. It's not just like hardware hasn't, like, this panel is XX, like if you go to one of those build breakdowns, right? They'll rip this thing apart and they'll say like, oh, this speaker is only $2 or something like that. And they do it generally speaking, based off, just the raw materials. What's missing in these conversations are early access. So why do you think it is that the Facebook headset had XR2 a year before everybody else? They're paying for that early access. It wasn't a coincidence that, hey, XR2, all of a sudden only the Quest 2 has it for an entire year. That's not a coincidence. And so they're paying for early access for this licensing. And on top of that, they're paying access to all these different licensing features within the reference design on top of that. So yes, that's an absolutely potentially accurate estimate. It's double of what they're selling to consumers. So yeah, I think that with the acquisition of Pico, the nice thing about
if it happens,
is cost is one of the biggest barriers of entry to the VR space, because a lot of people treat the VR space now. I'm not like you and I. Like the average person treats the VR space like a toy, like a Switch or something like that. So
which
when
makes
they
sense.
buy,
I can respect that. I mean, to an average person, it is a toy.
Right. It's not bad, but it's their comparable. So cost is the biggest thing to affect their decision to adopt. So they're doing the right approach to get as many people as possible, and they're spending heavily for it. And, it just goes back into the conversation of what I'm saying of why this is such a big problem for startups. For consumers, is it a big problem? Not really, because it doesn't matter if there's other platforms. If Facebook is taking all these features, co-opting them, making them free, fuck no.
No, it's great.
And that's one of the biggest... Yeah, and that's one of the biggest problems with American antitrust. American antitrust, what constitutes, harm to the consumer, generally has to do with things that, Facebook is not essentially doing, because what they're doing is, even though they're co-opting someone, they're making it free. So it's harder for them to say that this is harming consumers, because the products that they're providing are for free, generally.
Yeah. All right, I didn't think about it that way. So I see. Yeah. So your argument of breaking it up gets killed, because if the argument for breaking a monopoly is for the benefit of the consumer,
exactly,
you can't break it up if you can prove that actually what we're doing is all good for the consumer. Okay.
Consumer harm is how you define a monopoly.
Hit that subscribe button to stay on top of the daily clips, or catch the debates and fireside chats live on the main channel down in the video description. See you next time, Space Cowboys.